So back in 2003, Martin Dillon, who was kind of a cataloging guru at OCLC, he was expressing the concerns of many within the library community that the Dublin Core elements dealing with the agents responsible for the content. So we're talking about here the creator, the contributor, and to some extent the publisher. He felt that these elements were kind of naked and unqualified, and as a consequence, inadequate for many uses. He felt that they just were not sufficient. This was all happening at a time when the cataloging profession was seeing the advent of shelf-ready materials. So basically the cataloging was done before the materials reached the library, and so there was not as much of a demand for cataloger, or the skills of catalogers. And so this was all kind of coming about at a time when there were calls that, the sky was falling for the cataloging profession, and catalogers were looking closely at what might be their next job, basically cataloging the web. Remember, that's what Dublin Core was designed for. And they were not happy with what they saw as a lack of guidelines for using Dublin Core. Remember, they had worked for years with the American Cataloging Rules, or AACR2 rules, which are highly prescriptive. And one of the consequences that they noted was that because the rules of Dublin Core were not specific enough, the guidelines were being reinvented at every new use with a new set of kind of local instructions, which oftentimes were applied inconsistently. And that's kind of the that is kind of the cataloger's biggest fear, is that we lose standardization, and their fear was we were going to lose this with Dublin Core. And so they argued, what they were arguing for was a standard, or they were arguing that this particular Dublin Core was a standard that was vague and, as a result, difficult to apply. If you were at a library conference in early 2000, there was a lot of time and energy spent on trying to convince libraries, OCLC was doing this, that they should use Dublin Core to catalog the web. This, would be the cataloger's new line of work. And again, there were all of these criticisms that Dublin Core was incomplete and undocumented, and therefore it was really failing to provide a convenient, easy to use standard for describing anything, really. Now, at about the same time, on a parallel track, is a group of folks, one of which was Rebecca Gunter at Library of Congress's Network Development and MARC Standards Office, who were looking to the future needs in the library and related communities for descriptive metadata standards. The challenge of MARC as an encoding language was already familiar with the library world. For those of you that are not familiar with traditional cataloging, MARC was developed at a time when computers lacked the power and speed to handle free text information. So needless to say, this language that came about in the 1960s for cataloging basically books, it demanded that the schema be pretty complicated and very, very granular. So your library's ILS, or your library's local system or local catalog, they can take this data in what you see in the first record capture there on the screen, which is a MARC record. They can take that data and they can share it with other cataloging systems because they're all using MARC, this machine readable language for metadata, or for basically cataloging records. But it couldn't be used on the web and other systems. So in a sense, its uses were very, very limited. In 2003, it was already apparent that XML as an encoding language, which was what MARC was, it was quickly becoming the standard. Now, next week, Nancy Steinman will be coming in and talking to you about kind of the elegance and the ease of use that XML offers. But suffice to say for now that its power was already widely recognized in 2003. With web content growing by leaps and bounds and the growing popularity of XML, and this kind of reinvigorated cry to dump MARC because it was so complicated and could only be used in library systems, the Library of Congress developed MARC XML. This is a format that provides lossless conversion from MARC to an XML syntax. Now remember back when we were talking about digital objects in 121, we talked about lossy and lossless conversion or lossless file formats for our digital objects. And remember, lossy means that data is getting thrown out, and lossless means that it's one for one. So now taking that same concept and looking at it through a metadata, looking at it in a metadata, from a metadata perspective, LC developed this XML format that provides a lossless, so there's no information lost, between MARC, this old language, and an XML syntax. So MARC XML made it possible for end users to view a kind of MARC-like record that uses language-based rather than numerical tags. More similar then to the end user record that is shown in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. So you'll notice that the record in the lower corner, it's using language tags as opposed to those numeric tags that are common in the MARC record. The other thing to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about MARC is that MARC is an encoding language used by library systems, but it also includes a set of metadata elements which we describe as a schema. So all of those numeric tags that you see or fields that you see in the record on the left, that is, excuse me, I have a cold. Those are the metadata elements that make up the MARC schema. So Library of Congress came up with MARC XML, but they reasoned that while it made sense to develop the XML syntax, they weren't yet ready to throw out the original MARC schema. This came about at a time during which the Library of Congress and major academic institutions around the world were embarking on digitization programs. For the Library of Congress, they had been authorized and funded by Congress to create what was called a National Digital Library that would provide access to public domain image resources, as well as audio, video, and archived web content. The American Memory Project is really a search engine maintained by the Library of Congress and uses OAI protocol for metadata harvesting. So what that means is they're getting metadata from other institutions. They're pulling together digital objects from a variety of institutions to create this collection. So why does the American Memory Project care about mods? Well, if you're digitizing, the logic would be, we'll just create the records in Dublin Core. Why do we have to develop a new metadata schema? Some of the new projects did this. They just went ahead and did the digitization, and they used Dublin Core from the onset. But for others, ELSI included, for a lot of the newly digitized material, there was legacy metadata for these materials, and not surprisingly, that metadata was MARC. Remember, though, that many did not like Dublin Core's vagueness, and so they wanted a schema like MARC but easier. Now, while it was a vision that some institutions would want to create original resource description records using this XML encoded schema, the primary driving force really for the creation of MODS was the need to be able to carry this selected data from existing MARC 21 records into new records that would work in a web environment, so outside of a MARC system. That's what this was created for. So they have all this legacy metadata that they need to make use of for the American Memory Project, and new collections are being developed, and there are some who want a more complete solution than Dublin Core, but they're unwilling to adopt full-on MARC. And, you know, the complaints about MARC had been that MARC is just simply too big and too complex. It has over 900 fields and subfields, and many argue that there are just too many fields to choose from. There's also what they call fixed field coding, and that can be somewhat cumbersome if you're not used to working with it. And that the identification of fields using numeric tags, it's difficult to learn, and it is not at all user-friendly. So what happened was the Library of Congress, with input from kind of interested experts, embarked on the development of MODS, which is an XML schema that includes a subset of data elements from MARC 21. Again, it's intended to carry data from existing MARC 21 records, as well as to enable the creation of original resource description records in this schema. So again, the process, or kind of the evolution here, was we had MARC, they took MARC, and then they created MARC XML, which is a one-for-one match. So they took the 245 field, which is kind of the statement of responsibility field, and they took that and directly and made corresponding fields in MARC XML. But they were still looking for, many within the community were still looking for something that was MARC-like but easier. And so then the primary reason for doing this was that they had data that was sitting in old systems. And so they needed to be able to take that MARC data and make that into, or convert that into a record that was easier to use and to understand. So we ended up with MODS. So MODS has 20 top-level elements and then 47 sub-elements. So thinking back to Dublin Core, think about simple Dublin Core and then qualified Dublin Core. Qualified Dublin Core, remember, just kind of refines the basic Dublin Core elements. And you see the same thing with MODS. So we have 20 top-level elements, 47 sub-elements. And of course, MOD uses human understandable tags in place of the 3-digit tags in the subfields of MARC. So instead of the 245 field, we get the title field. MODS also ignores most of those fixed field data elements. There's a couple of exceptions. Physical format codes and the genre codes are getting used, but a little bit differently in MODS. Each of the MODS elements can be combined with attributes, which Nancy is going to discuss again at our next meeting. And so these would include terms like authority and type to create detailed or more detailed, specific and precise records. Some elements also allow for the use of what are called linking attributes, or X-links. That can link elements to URLs. So for example, the name element, which is what MODS uses to, say, enter information about the creator, that element could be linked to a URL for, say, a name authority file or a website of regarding the item's creator. So you can link out to information outside of the MODS record that contains supplementary information or an authority file about, say, that creator. This is another advantage kind of using the XML format, because you can link out and make use of other web content. And ultimately what it does is it allows you to create a more precise record. MODS also introduced some efficiencies and some innovations. For example, MODS defines a structure called name that represents the fields and the subfields for personal and corporate names, and also for conferences. And this structure can be used anywhere that names would appear, either as main entries, which would be a creator, or added entries, which would be something like Dublin Core's creators, or even subjects. So with a name field and your value is William Shakespeare, you can parse it out so that the name field would be name, the attribute would be part, and it would be Shakespeare and William, or you could parse that out further and do name part Shakespeare, name part William. And then you could include, again, in that name element, name part type equals date, and then include the birth and death dates. And you can do this both when you're working with names as the creator of the material, or you can also do this in the subject field. Now, although it is derived from MARC 21 and is much more detailed than Dublin Core, MODS has many fewer rules than MARC 21. You don't have to use AACR2. Like Dublin Core, there are no required fields, and elements can be presented in any order within the XML record. And this is one of the other things to keep in mind about MODS. MODS stipulates that the encoding language must be XML. That's what it was designed for. Also, every element except record info, which we'll take a look at in a few minutes, can be repeated as many times as needed to capture information about the item. Now, MODS is designed to be used to create basically bibliographic records of items, and it can be used with any set of cataloging rules. So again, it's not tied to AACR2 rules. There are many controlled vocabularies in existence. These vocabularies vary in terms of coverage, format, application, who created them. And the MOD schema allows for the use of really any of these controlled vocabularies. I want to kind of, at this point, go over a couple of definitions, because I realize that while we talked in week 2, we defined schema, we defined metadata, we've got some new terms that have been thrown in here, particularly this week, a little bit when we were talking about Dublin Core, and I just want to go back over these and make sure that they're clear to you. So the schema, a metadata schema, the definition here is it's a plan showing the relationships between the metadata elements, and there's usually some rules for the use of those elements and the management of the metadata, specifically as regards to the semantics. And semantics just simply means how we define that element. So how does Dublin Core define title? How does MODS define name? So it's just the definitions that are used by particular schemas for an element. It also has to do with the syntax. And the syntax, you'll see you get a definition below there. This refers to the rules created as to the rules that relate to the structure of the fields or the elements of the metadata. And it also addresses the language that is used. So Dublin Core, remember, It's not tied to any particular encoding language. And so you can use plain text, you can use HTML, you can use XML, you could also use RDF. Mods, as I mentioned, is expressed in XML. So going back, schema then, it shows the plan for the relationships between the metadata elements. It defines the elements in any rules that relate to how those elements are to get used. It indicates the encoding language that should be used for that particular schema. And the last point there is that it addresses the optionality or obligation level of values. So this has to do with which elements as well as which values are appropriate for that or to be used for that particular metadata schema. And oftentimes we will hear this schema referred to as the element set. But the element set, remember, is just the list of title, creator, publisher, whatever. But there's more to a schema than just that element set. It's the rules that go with that. And one of those rules, of course, is the syntax. Which encoding languages can be used with this schema? Now, the last definition that is there on the slide is attributes. And attributes is kind of a new one for us. And attributes comes out of the XML world. Attributes are really used to refine the meaning of an element in which they appear. I apologize for the coughing. This came up this week, and there's just no way that I can talk and not cough. And so with attributes, as we've seen in a couple of slides here already, attributes can be used to basically provide information about what authority are you using. So we're working with the subject field. Well, where does the subject term comes from? The attribute, the type is LCSH, or the type is the Thesaurus for Graphic Materials. So it tells us where that term came from, which means that we can execute a more, or our end users can execute a more precise search. Okay, so here are the top level elements for mods. We have 20 of them, as I mentioned. Some of them are going to look very similar to Dublin Core, and some of them are going to be radically different from Dublin Core. In the next few slides, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because one of the things that I want you to do this week is I want you to take a look at the website for mods, where you, again, you'll find more complete information about how each one of these elements, how they define them, and also how they're to be used. So the first one is title info, title for Dublin Core. This is, of course, a word or a phrase. Now, this is normally appearing in a resource. Remember that this was initially designed for materials that had legacy metadata, which means there may have already been a title. If there was a title, you use it. And so that's why it's saying normally appearing in a resource. For new digital collections, they're not going to be normally appearing in many cases. There are some attributes that can be used. Type, authority, language. Again, we'll look more at attributes in the next couple of weeks, beginning with our discussion with Nancy. There are some sub-elements, title, specifically title, and subtitle. So title info, again, can contain other information, and so you may choose to use the title sub-element within the title info element. An example here, in the title info field, we have title, Mammoth Lakes Museum, and then there is an alternate or an alternative title here. So title, the attribute is type, alternative, Hayden Cabin, and then the end of the title info field. Now, what's important for this week is that you understand the elements themselves. So what is title info? What is title? What is not important this week is that you understand this structure, the way it's put together. So the way it's being written here with the less than and greater than signs, if that helps, and also the attributes. You don't need to understand how this gets structured because, again, this is something we're going to talk about next week. But I want you to begin to become familiar with the element names themselves. The next one, of course, is name. So the name of a person, an organization, or event associated in some way with the resource. So this is where you would typically put who created that material. Sub-elements include name part, which we saw with our example of William Shakespeare, could be affiliation, role. So if you're using name for a collection and you want your audience to understand that this was the photographer, role could be photographer. And in the example here, you see name part, Stuart, Jack. Display form. This is another attribute that you can use for name. So I want, while we do last name, first name, for searching for the display, I want it to show normal language, which would be Jack Stewart. Role authority. In this case, we're using the Mark-Relator codes. Remember, we talked about Mark-Relator codes last week. And in this particular case, he is the photographer. Now, the MODS type of resource element is quite similar to the Dublin Core type, except that it is not used for more specific type and genre terms, which are sometimes used in Dublin Core type. This element includes a high-level type that categorizes the material in a very general way and broad way, using a very short enumerated list of values that's shown there on the slide. So you'll notice we have still image and we have moving image, which we have in the type list that we use with Dublin Core, but we don't have image. So this is a little bit different. Again, more specific typing is done in the next element, which is genre. So the genre element should be used to characterize the content of the resource, and it is more specific than the type field is. And you'll notice that for the genre field, it is using, in this case, you have the ability to indicate the authority that you want to use. And in this case, we've chosen to use art and architecture, and we're using photographs. So this is a term from art and architecture from their genre, list of genres. So again, genre is going to be more specific than type. Do you have to use it? No. The other thing to remember is genre is referring now to the original intellectual content. Now notice that MODS has several types of date sub-elements, and we saw this within Dublin Core as well. Here we have, for the origin info, date created. So that was when the original was created. So origin info really is information about the origin of the resource. This could be the place of origin or publication. It could be information about the original publisher, and of course the dates. Think about remember the postcard example that we saw a couple of weeks ago where from the university in Canada, where they had a collection of photographs that had publisher information about the original postcards, but then it also had publisher information about the university that was publishing the digital versions. So in the origin info field, if you were now describing those postcards, in this field is where you would put information about who the publisher of those original postcards was. There are several sub-elements: place, publisher, these date fields, as well as edition, issuance, and frequency. These really have to do more with text materials. And in our example here, in origin field, you'll see date created 1962. And you'll notice that the next date listed here is date captured 2015. Here's one of the rules to remember about a date captured field. A date captured sub-element is the element that is used to record when material was digitized. So this is an important field for us because we're digitizing materials. So that's where you'll want to include that date. Language is kind of a container element. The sub-element is language term, and it's really used to express the language of the resource in either textual, as you'll see in the example there, so language term is English, or as we did in Dublin Core, remember we use codes, 8601 codes, standard codes, and so you can use either textual or coded or both. But again, if you're going to use a coded form, you'll want to use the authority attribute and then indicate the source of those codes. So tell us where you got that code. So the MODS physical description element is roughly parallel to the Dublin Core format element. The element may contain information either about a digital resource, the analog original, or both. The form and extent sub-elements are roughly equivalent to the Dublin Core medium and extent refinements. Notice here that there is a separate sub-element for internet media type. So in our example here, in the physical description field, we have form photograph, which is for the original, extent 3 by 7 inches, again extent, this is still describing the original, but then we have internet media type as a sub-element with the value image/JPEG, and this again should be familiar to you because this is what we used in Dublin Core from the internet media type list. And then the last sub-element there is date or digital origin, and this is really describing what has happened here. And so the value here is reformatted to digital. So it's just clarifying that while we have physical description information here about an original, in fact, this was reformatted to a JPEG image. Abstract, this one and the next one, table of contents. With the kinds of materials we've been working on in this program, they're primarily images, and we're not working a whole lot with text, but just know that you can use abstract and table of contents, which are top-level elements, if you're working with textual materials. So abstract is going to be used for any kind of free text, summary or description of the content of the resource, and table of contents is basically going to be giving you information about perhaps chapters in the book, but how it is that it is organized. Now in Dublin Core we had audience. In MODS we have target audience. So it's just a description of the intellectual level of the audience for which the resource is intended. And you can there's a couple of different attributes that you can use here. So you can use authority, you can use language, but there aren't any sub-elements for this one. So in our example here, our target audience is juvenile. So the note element, we have description in Dublin Core. MODS uses note, and again, it's in this field, you're going to put general textual information relating to a resource. So it's kind of the opportunity to record information considered important for end users. But what's really important about mods is that it makes it very clear that you should only include in this field information that isn't appropriate for other more specific mods elements. So we talked in Dublin Core about not being redundant, not putting the same information in multiple fields. In mods, they address this head on and say that the description or the note field in this case is not to be used to provide redundant information. So if it fits somewhere else, put it in the more appropriate field. Now in our example here, we wanted to include information about the performers in a movie. And so we opened up the note field, and the type here is performers. That's what we have used as our value for this particular attribute type. And then the value itself is Gregory Peck, who plays Atticus Finch, and Mary Badham, who plays Scout. But again, you want to use this field in much the same way that you use the description field in Dublin Core, but pay careful attention that you're not including information that could be recorded elsewhere. Subject, kind of same as Dublin Core. It's going to be a term or phrase representing the primary topics on which a work is focused. It's important in using this when using the subject field, I think anyway, that you do use the attribute authority so people understand where these values are coming from. And then there are a number of sub-elements that you can use for subject. And you'll see the examples here on the bottom. Subject authority is Library of Congress, Thesaurus for Graphic Materials. The topic, so the value that we're using is playgrounds. Identifier, pretty much the same way, pretty much the same definition of identifier as is used by Dublin Core. It contains a unique standard number code that distinctively identifies a resource. If you can use type, that's helpful. So if you have something like an ISBN number for some kind of monograph, then you could say identifier type equals ISBN, and then you would put in the ISBN number. There are no sub-elements for the identifier field. Access condition is pretty much the same as the rights field that we see in Dublin Core, so it's information about restrictions imposed on access to a resource. And that would, of course, include copyright information. There are a couple of attributes that could be used. There are no sub-elements. And so you'll see access condition in our example here, copyright Pasadena City College, all rights reserved. Access condition type equals use and reproduction. So what are the use and reproduction specifications? Copying allowed for non-commercial use only. Please credit Pasadena City College. Now, the mods part element has no counterpart in Dublin Core. And this particular element, it is used to designate the physical parts of a resource in a very detailed form. And so if you think about, if you're working with something that has chapters, if you're working with a newspaper, if you're working with, say, a serial of some kind, this field is used to record information about which volume we're working with, which page within that volume are we working with. And you'll see that there are a couple of sub-elements that can be used. So detail, but extent and date are very common, as well as text. Again, we probably wouldn't use these a lot for the digital images that we've been working with, but if you're working with anything, particularly with text materials that has multiple scans, then this is where this element is particularly beneficial. And here's kind of an example of that. So part, title info, we have the Washington Observer. Part, detail, type is page number. So, and then number. So what we're saying is that this record is describing what you would find on page 3 of the Washington Observer. And if you scrolled further down, we would probably see information about the dates and that kind of thing that would further identify the material that we're working with. Now, record info is a kind of a container element that includes sub-elements relating to information necessary for managing the metadata record. This type of administrative information can establish the kind of the provenance of a metadata record and may enable better interpretation of the content of that record. And it may also include information that is relevant only to the creating or managing institution. So it is an element that is important to the institution that is managing those digital objects. This is the one element within MODS that is not repeatable. You can only have one. It's intended to show the origin or the provenance of the MODS record. So this could include things like what methods were used to create the metadata record. Was it machine generated? Because those are becoming more mainstream. Or was this human prepared, which is more typical in libraries? Also, it could include information about what transformations have been applied. Perhaps this started off as a MARC 21 record and then got converted to a MARC XML record and then to a MODS record. So it is in this field that you would basically document that evolution. It can be free text, or your institution may establish, some locally controlled values for consistency's sake in the record. And again, there is no equivalent field in either MARC, MARC XML, or Dublin Core. You'll see in our example here under record info, record creation date, October 8th, 2002, and that this was a human-generated metadata record. So like the Dublin Core relation and source elements, the MODS related item element provides information about a different resource related to the one being described or represented in the main body of the metadata record. Now, unlike Dublin Core, the MODS related item element may contain much more detailed information about the related resource. Every single one of the MODS top-level elements and sub-elements and attributes can be used as sub-elements within the related item container or field. The specific type of relationship of the related item is designated by the type attribute. And this can include preceding, succeeding, original, host, collection, constituent, series, other version, other format, and also the last one is referenced by. And so what this means is within a MODS record, you can create almost a full, complete record describing a related item. so if we look at this next one here, this example, so we have a newly digitized object that is added to an existing digital collection. And in this case, we're using related item to indicate that the material is part of the James Craven image collection. So in this case, our related item, the type is collection. Then we're including the title info element in the related item element. And inside of that is title, the James Craven Digital Images collection. And so in this case, we're only using really one element or two, an element and a sub-element from the mod schema in order to indicate that this particular object is part of the James Craven Digital Images collection. But you could have within the related item field a full complete metadata record for whatever object or collection or whatever that this particular object is related to. Okay, so that we've just gone through all of the 20 top-level elements within mods, and we've talked about some of the sub-elements, and we've also hit upon the attribute feature that's available in mods because it is XML based. And again, we'll talk a lot more next week with Nancy about how to structure a mods record. A couple of sources that you might want to take a look at, or a source that you might want to take a look at for some best practices. So this is not the LC site where they have all of the documentation for the development of and how to use mods, but this is actually a best practices document that was created for the Aquifer project. This URL has changed several times, and oftentimes I will give this out in class and then we'll go to click on it and it will have been moved. So if this link is not working for you at the time that you go to look for it, just simply do a search for the Digital Library Federation Aquifer Implementation Guidelines for shareable mods records, and you can get to this particular document, which does a really great job of, again, providing further explanation as to how to implement the mods metadata element. So who's using this? Well, the mods schema is currently being used by academic libraries, national libraries, medical libraries, technical libraries, but the mods community is still pretty small. But even though it is small, it's fairly robust. I mean, there's a lot of work going on within the mods community. Now, there are many ways in which mods is being used, and that kind of speaks to the power and the flexibility of the mod schema. At Chicago Public, metadata describing electronic finding aids for archival and manuscript collections, they were being extracted from an online catalog as mods records and then being made available for harvesting. So basically, they were able to take those mods records that were built as mods records in an online catalog, and they're sharing them with the world through harvesting. Largely on a grant-supported project basis, UC Berkeley has digitized and continues to digitize portions of its archival collections and selected materials. The digitized materials, these are exported as METS objects, and we'll talk about METS a little bit later, but basically METS is just kind of a wrapper that can hold metadata from several different schemas, and for them they're creating mods objects, but they have, or they're creating METS objects, but they have mods metadata inside of them. Now, most of these METS objects are then ingested into the California Digital Library. And so if you go to the Online Archive of California, or Calisphere, that's where you can see many of UC Berkeley's MODS records. Academic Commons is Columbia University's digital repository where faculty and students and staff, they can deposit the results of their scholarly work and research, and the repository uses MODS for their descriptive metadata. Going kind of the other direction, used for the contribution of metadata records to the Australian National Bibliographic Database, the project is based on a collection of metadata records through Open Archives Initiative, so harvesting. And what they're doing is they're taking those MODS records and they're transforming them to Dublin Core records, which is used within a common system. And so they're pulling in both Dublin Core records and they're pulling in MODS records, and those MOD records are being created to Dublin Core, which are being used in a system that uses Dublin Core records as their metadata. And then those records, some of those records are also being converted to MARC via MODS. So you'll see how that that evolution of MARC to MARCS-ML to MODS, we can move back and forth across those metadata schemas because we've created, within the communities, we've created mappings to make that possible. So these records can move between systems that accept and work with different metadata schemas. So here's a couple of tools that are available through the Library of Congress for creating metadata records. There's the user guide, there's guidelines, and then there's the list of elements, sub-elements, and attributes. I would encourage you to spend the bulk of your time looking at the list of elements, sub-elements, and attributes so that you know how to use the elements. And so here is a MODS record, or it's a partial MODS record. And what I've done is I've basically color-coded this so that you can see the top level elements, you can see the attributes, and you can see the sub-elements. So we have title info, we have within title info, title, and then we also have type, where we're including an alternative title for our title. And then we also have in title info, we've included some of the name information. So in this case, we have a name type family, we have a given name. So in this case, we've taken that name, just like when we were looking at it with William Shakespeare, we saw it put in as Shakespeare, William, and then I mentioned to you that you could break it out separately, so it would be name part Shakespeare, name part William. Well, that's what's been done here, and they've included date information here. And then if you go down a little bit further, they've also used the MARC Relator Authority to indicate, in this case, the role of this individual, which was the photographer. Now, one of the things that I want you to do this week is to get a bit of experience working with another digital asset management system. So you spent a fair amount of time in Library 121 working with Content DM. Well, this week what I'd like you to do is take a look at Islandora. Now, I'm going to, in addition to this slide, I have provided you with some detailed instructions as to how to access and use Islandora's sandbox. So their sandbox is just where you go in and play around with it. Everything you put in it one day gets wiped out that night. And I've given you a couple of images that I would like you to go ahead and ingest them into Islandora and then create a metadata record. Now, why are you using Islandora? Because Islandora uses mods as their metadata schema. Islandora, I will also, in this week's module, I will provide you with some additional information about this particular digital asset management system, but know that it is an open source management system. It comes out of a university in Canada. It is open source, and unlike Omeka, which we took a look at in 121, but not to any great depth. Unlike Omeka, which offers a hosted option where you can put your content on their server and they basically manage it for you, Islandora, you have to go through another company really in order to get a hosted option. Islandora, though, has a really strong user community. There's a lot of development going on, and it is a digital asset management system that's really coming up on the radar of many large institutions for managing their digital collections. But it's one I'd like you to get some familiarity with. They will not give us a license to basically have our own implementation, and really logistically that would be rather difficult because we would have to load it on a PCC server, which I would have a hard time convincing them to do that. But they do make the sandbox available, and so that's the tool that we're going to use to get a little bit of experience using this particular asset management system. But again, the reason I want you to look at this one is because they do use mods. So there will be a couple of images that are in the module for this week that you can upload. You can also upload other digital images you might have. There's detailed instructions for how to access and how to use Islandora to ingest or upload your images into the system. And then there is also additional information in the module about the Islandora software. So that concludes this week's session for mods.